Okay, and welcome to the next video after that pause. I just wanted to return just briefly before I get into the content here that some of the ideas presented in this particular text may be challenging for you intellectually. Maybe not. Maybe uh, they're finding a lot of purchase and you're getting a real sense of what these authors are trying to communicate to you. But it's dense. It certainly is very dense. And even for me, coming to it familiar with a lot of this critical perspective and a lot of ideas that the authors introduce here philosophically and so forth, there's a lot to it and there's a lot to take in. Which is why at the beginning of the first video I talked about it will take a few goings through before you've kind of got the sense of all of it. But I guess in defense of why you should work hard with this particular chapter in terms of that kind of critical understanding about the situation of teaching in our country right now, where it's come from, how do you look at it, how do you come to terms with some of the challenges? Is there, thinking about a way forward with all of this kind of knowledge, and how does that then shape the kind of teacher you become? I think, it's important to begin things because you are at the very start of your master's, and note that it is a master's. So in that regard, it does encourage, and we've purposefully built into this course, a rich theoretical approach, and certainly this unit has a rich theoretical approach. But you need to begin these first initial steps, at least starting your understanding. And if many of these ideas are very new to you, that's okay. Try not to feel overwhelmed by it. And again, you may put this chapter aside and say, okay, I think I need to come back to this maybe at the end of the unit, at the end of the year, and have another look at things. But that's the idea, that hopefully it plants a seed in you to just begin engaging in a more critical way with what you're doing and what it means to be a teacher and your relationship to that. So into the content now on page 47, and they begin this section, Shaping the Profession. I just wanted to highlight just a couple of points here, namely around, there's a point that I make in class at times, and I'll make it here. This notion that when people are asked what is the oldest profession, oftentimes you'll hear prostitution. I would actually hazard to say that teaching is the oldest profession, because if you think about all the way back into our prehistory, pre-recorded history, into all the way back into our origins as a human species in Africa, there were teachers. There were people who were given the role of teacher throughout their life, or they may have come to it as a young adult, but they assumed the role of tribal, cultural teacher, and I am referring most specifically to, say, the shaman and the medicine men. When you look at indigenous cultures throughout the world, there is always that person who, they were the healer as well, but they were also the translator, the teacher of stories to the tribe, or to, that culture, the transmitter of culture from generation to generation when there was no written text. So for me, that it talks to this deep history of teachers and where we've come from. But I guess if we look at it in the very modern age, teaching was created as a low status profession because mass education, certainly, industrial age and post the industrial age, again referring to that Ken Robinson video is useful here, that we had to educate the masses. Who are we going to get to do it? The clergy certainly can't do it. There's not enough of them. And there was starting to be a kind of fracturing of different religious groups, even in Christianity, obviously. how do we teach these different types of people en masse? And you create a low status, low paid, regulated occupation that, who can you get to sort of perform this work with children? Certainly with, young children initially. It's women, of course, they're the mothers. So women were a perfect fit for this low status, low paid, regulated occupation because it served the male hierarchy and hegemony of certainly the Industrial Revolution and post. So, but then what started to happen is that those who were in charge of education more broadly, the governance of education, both at the very top levels all the way through to more local levels, they needed men to create order in order for the implementation to be rolled out and be effective, and the management to be overseen by a man. So, men, as they do in many levels of society and professions in history, it's a different picture now, but certainly late 1800s throughout the 20th century, definitely dominated by men, but increasingly women post 1960s. So, and the authors say that in many respects, the teaching profession today continues to reflect these origins in its social and gendered composition. I'll just refer to the first point. I can tell you, just because I worked in the tertiary sector, and I'm sure you are aware, that the younger we look at in terms of schooling education, so younger children, early childhood education, kindergarten, etc., are overwhelmingly staffed by women. And we can go into talking about that, and we may do, I'm sure we will do, this notion that it's seen as safer, younger children are safer with women, and more women seem to be attracted to that role as well. So, how do you split the difference there? I think a lot of young men who want to work with young children are turned off working from kids because of their worries around, how will I be seen? So it's, that's certainly very gendered. Obviously, as we get into upper primary and high schools are very much equal in terms of gender a lot of the time, certainly in public schools. And struggle for professional status that continues to go on. Really, what do you think the AITSL standards are about? They're about trying to professionalize, operationalize the teaching workforce. So they say that if we can meet, if teachers can meet these standards, and we get them to demonstrate them, and we ensure that their professional development adheres to these standards, and when we performance manage teachers, it adheres to these sets of standards that are very calculated, very specific. Then we can say that teachers are now a profession because they do all these things. So that's where the standards sit there. And unions and the teaching workforce, obviously in public schooling, it's more obvious, but the unionization of teachers is so critical to so many elements of their work. Pay being the most obvious, but there's lots of other examples of where unions clearly shape, so the collective bargaining of unions shape the time of teachers in terms of what teachers are doing with their time while at work, etc., meetings, so forth. So unions are very, very important to understanding teachers in history and still today. I just want to focus on this point on page 48 because it's something that is often communicated to me as a pre-service teacher, educator, how when you do take those first initial steps into a school where you're either observing observing and then taking on some lessons of your own and teaching of your own and interacting with students, starting to create your own lesson plans and to deliver those plans. You always hear a number of people who go through that process at first, and it continues on as they develop. New teachers saying that our lecturers saying, the coursework is telling us one thing, that we've got to think about, exploring inclusive practices. And I'm even saying, think critically because it's so important. Engage with theory, be creative, all of that kind of humanist tradition of, sort of post-1960s liberal education about working in groups, about getting to know your students and building relationships with them. And that's all really important. But that at the end of the day, I've got to run a disciplined classroom where students are cooperating, that's safe, that I can transmit the required content that I need to teach, being the Australian curriculum now. And I've got a lot of it and not enough time, so I have to just get that stuff out there, get them ready to and assess them, test them. They've got to do well in the test, and the English and mathematics departments in schools are always intensely focused as well on NAPLAN and ensuring the children are prepared for NAPLAN and to do well in that test. So you'll feel this to a greater or lesser extent depending on the school that you're in, but this tension of being caught between thinking about putting into practice what you've been told in the university course and making that fit into all the kind of systemic restrictions or challenges, you might call them, that modern schooling presents in the modern age. Okay, so let's move on. I just want to briefly talk about these boxes that appear throughout the chapter. What are the implications for me? I think, again, this is getting you to think about important questions that whether or not you write these down, it's again, thinking about these questions and pondering them. And, when you're just considering the various aspects of what you're learning and going, okay, well, how do I relate to this? What are my beliefs and principles? How is that being transformed, maybe, by the ideas that you're encountering? So it's important that you do consider them. So I'm just going to pause it there again before I move on to the next section about discourses of education.